Welcome to all participants. Thank you for joining this webinar from Anti-Judaism to contemporary anti-Semitism, continuities and discontinuities. You are joining us from different parts of the world, therefore different contexts, also different time zones. Therefore, I say good day, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Lilian Apotheker, President of the International Council of Christians and Jews, the ICCJ, and I will be the moderator of this conversation. It's a privilege for me to introduce our two experts tonight on this panel, Adam Gregerman and Lev Topor. Adam Gregerman is an associate professor of Jewish studies and associate director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where he reaches out to many students. He's also vice chair of the CCJR, the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations, our member organization, ICCJ member organization in the United States. Adam Gregerman's field of expertise is Judaism in early Christianity. He has also published numerous articles on contemporary theological, philosophical, and ethical questions, in addition to this field of expertise. Thank you, Adam, for sharing your insights with us today. Lev Topor is joining us from the United Kingdom. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. His research fields are anti-Semitism, discrimination, and human rights. Lev has recently published Fishing for Nazis, Conspiracies, Anonymous Communications, and White Supremacy Networks on the Dark Web. When I say recently, this is very recently. The date of publication is December 30th, 2022. And 1 year ago, Lev published Why Do People Discriminate Against Jews? Thank you, Lev, for accepting our invitation to speak on this panel. With your help, Adam and Lev, we will try to discern the trajectory from anti-Judaism to contemporary anti-Semitism. I will allow myself to say a few words to introduce this subject with my own thoughts. While preaching love as a universal message, Christianity, in an effort to build its own identity, persistently has othered the Jews, thus othering the origin of its own faith. Themes of persecution appear very surprisingly in the Hebrew Bible, texts we are all familiar with. And these texts resonate like modern anti-Semitic utterances. We can hear them in Exodus 1, verses 8 to 10, in the mouth of Pharaoh. The Israelites have become far too numerous for us. If war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us. In Hebrew, the words are Rav ve'atzum mimenu, a small population that all of the sudden appears numerous and powerful, and also capable of treason. Or further, in the words of Haman in the book of Esther 3, verses 8 to 9. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Again, a ready-made rhetoric for modern-day anti-Semitic discourse. At the time of writing, these texts already conveyed a sense of persecution, and the persecution must have seemed real. Interestingly, there is no trace of this in Christian anti-Judaism, with one exception maybe. The question of treason appears in the figure of Judas. Curiously, the only one remembered as a Jew prior to the Vatican II Council. One of the problems we have to deal with today is that all these tropes have permeated public opinion, and even though the churches have changed their discourse, a certain culture of prejudice towards the Jews has permeated secular thought. Let's hear from our experts on possible continuities and discontinuities. Adam, the floor is yours. We are eagerly waiting for your remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to join this important discussion, and it's great to be able to at least virtually meet Lev and have a chance to discuss some of these issues with him as we were preparing. So thanks so much. It was common until relatively recently to draw a distinction between theological anti-Judaism and racial anti-Semitism. However, scholars are increasingly recognizing that this traditional division between these two categories needs to be rethought, that there is an anti-Judaism over here and separate, related perhaps in somehow, but in many ways unrelated, is racist or secular anti-Semitism. Scholars are recognizing that that division is a too tidy division because it rests, for starters, on a rigid chronology. It makes it sound like there was one period and one hateful attitude, anti-Judaism, that then gave way and was replaced by another form of hatred as society moved from the pre-modern to the modern period. Kind of the original model, but nowadays is being questioned quite appropriately. The second reason to question this tidy separation is because by separating anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism, in some ways it obscures the overlaps and suggests that there are greater differences than maybe actually in fact it obscures the nature of the hostility that may overlap between these two different forms of opposition to Jews. It also is in some ways indifferent to the context than we should be. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of the blurring of these categories comes in the work of the historian John Connolly, who has he's written recently about Catholic-Jewish relations. From Enemy to Brother was his book, and he gives a very striking example of early 20th century Catholics who were hostile to Jews, suspicious of Jews, even after those Jews had been baptized. That is, that there was some sort of ineradicable aspect of Jewish personhood or identity that even baptism couldn't wipe out. Now, that's a theologically shocking idea, but it nonetheless was found in the writings of, in this case, for example, early 20th century Catholic, prominent Catholic thinkers and theologians. Therefore, there is an important discussion to be had as we're beginning today about the relationship between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, as we have increasing recognition that that tidy division doesn't really work. As the session today formulates the issue, I think it's appropriate to actually frame this as a question. a question between how much continuity and how much discontinuity. So let me start by saying, if we want to use this formulation, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, we have to start by sort of being clear about what it is that's being compared. And I think historically, we therefore need to start by looking at theological anti-Judaism, which certainly chronologically is undeniably the first sort of form of hostility to the Jews that emerges after the so-called Greco-Roman forms of hostility to Jews, some of which even overlap with early Christianity, but we're going to sort of put those aside. I'll actually say sort of parenthetically that Greco-Roman hostility to Jews is largely discontinuous with what emerges in early Christianity and even in the New Testament. The Greco-Roman forms of hostility to Jews largely focused on their some cases their sort of oddity, the strangeness of their practices, their seeming misanthropic views of others. And so not the sort of things that got much carried over into early Christian hostility. And so if we're thinking about continuity and discontinuity, at least in that case, there's primarily really discontinuity. But it's helpful, I think, to start with the sort of classic example of anti-Judaism, which emerges already in the New Testament, but really gets going in the period of the second, third, fourth centuries CE or AD. And what I want to emphasize in particular is, and I think it's helpful to look at Greco-Roman writings, is that by comparison with what we call sort of pagan hostility to Jews, Jews and Christian thought from the earliest days, and not surprisingly, of the so-called Jesus movement, Jews have a very prominent place in the, I'm going to use the term anachronistically, but the Christian consciousness. That wasn't the case beforehand for really any culture or any group. And yet with the birth of Christianity, Jews have this sort of singular role for a lot of reasons. I don't have to elaborate on them now, but it's important to recognize that the centrality of Judaism and Jewishness vis-a-vis this emerging new, largely Gentile religion was early and had profound influence upon all later attempts at Christian self-definition. Some of the forms that emerge in this, really new world of anti-Judaism are the sort of fundamental claim that the Jews are the ones who should have believed and did not, and therefore they are sort of fundamentally mistaken, fundamentally misunderstand what it is that they should get and accept. There's a shift as well towards a more hostile view of Jews. Presumably in the very earliest stages, there was this sort of inner Jewish conflict about, Jews should have believed that Jesus was the expected Messiah, as some Jews were claiming and other Jews denied that. As you move forward in time, however, images of Jews as a force for evil do really begin to emerge, with ideas about the accusation that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. And then this idea is carried forward to claims about the persecution of Christians by Jews. And to just to take an example from the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, writing in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, provides an illustration of this view at a very early period. And let me put that up on our screen. Okay. Lev, I'll ask you a favor. Can you tell me if you can you see that? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. Writing in this perhaps fictional dialogue, Justin says to his 2nd century interlocutor, not talking about those who were said to have killed Jesus, but rather to Jews living 100 years later, that you Jews also hate us Christians and murder us who believe. Also writing in chapter 16 of the dialogue, for you Jews do not have the authority to act murderously against us, but as often as you were able, you did. The idea here, importantly, being that the pattern established with the killing of Jesus is a sort of template for future Jewish behavior. therefore the Jew is a danger to Christians. This is remarkable as a trope because it actually will continue to emerge even when Jews live under Christian rule. Even in Christendom, Jews are seen as a kind of dangerous force within Christian society, often in a very literal sense. In a more sort of, how do I say, non-literal sense, the prominence of the idea of sort of Jews as a sort of spiritual contagion is certainly found in much of Christian theology, that there's a kind of danger that having Jews around can lead people to believe the wrong things, can lead people to stray. Even the presence of unbelief is in some Christian societies seen as threatening. There are examples, of course, of medieval Spain and sort of removing anyone that's in any way challenging the sort of dominant religious dogma. And then, sort of the fundamental claim, of course, that Judaism itself is null and void. The notion that the covenant has been canceled, that Jews are no longer the chosen people of God, but that their disobedience has resulted in their replacement in God's favor by Christians, in particular Gentile Christians. Now, these categories and a few others are the building blocks of anti-Judaism. And therefore, when we turn to questions whether there's continuity or discontinuity in hostility toward Jews, we have to keep these accusations in mind as a starting point. And one of the things I thought would be helpful to grapple with this question then of continuity and discontinuity is to look at two models for discussing continuity and discontinuity offered by two relatively contemporary historians, Raoul Hilberg, the very well-known Holocaust historian, who wrote a very important book, The Destruction of European Jewry, the first edition in 1961. And the other person I want to look at, and sort of his model, was Yosef Yerushalmi, also a very distinguished historian from Columbia, and was part of a program of speeches and responses in the early 1970s about the Holocaust, held at St. John the Divine. Yerushalmi, in the excerpt I'm going to discuss today, is responding to a presentation by Rosemary Ruther, at least in her early career, scholar of Christian anti-Judaism. So let me do this. I want to start with looking at the view of Raoul Hilberg, and he's going to stand for the position of continuity in a strong way. And so Hilberg offers as his main point that there are a range of options for hostility toward Jews, but that they are all of a kind. That is, it's as if one is moving along a spectrum with options along that spectrum, but nonetheless not necessarily a kind of qualitative difference. I'm going to turn to some examples of what he had to say, but I want to just sort of summarize his point of view, which is to say that he says that you kind of move, certainly in history, from the first step, which is attempts at conversion of Jews. Then you move on to the next step, he says, or sort of, folks move on to the next step of immigration, support for the immigration of Jews, and finally annihilation. This is a sort of range of options, and I'm going to put some excerpts from his history book up on the screen for us. Okay. A couple quotes I think illustrate this perspective of continuity, this idea of continuity. Hilberg says, the process of hostility toward Jews began with an attempt to drive the Jews into Christianity. The development was continued in order to force the victims into exile. It was finished when Jews were driven to their deaths. That is, again, this spectrum of options, not qualitatively different. Noting that in the 19th century, European anti-Semites, who were themselves motivated by secular views, were in many ways just simply falling along this spectrum of options, in this case, in favor of the emigration of Jews, or to put it more bluntly, the expulsion of Jews. The most sort of sharp illustration of his argument can be seen in this, I think, kind of well-known chart in which he has gathered in the left column on each page the Christian laws that were intended to limit Jews, burden Jews, etc. What he calls canonical law. And he parallels them with Nazi laws. And so you have 2 full pages here moving mostly chronologically, and you can just sort of go back and forth across the page and see right at the start prohibition on intermarriage and intercourse between Christians and Jews, Synod of Elvira in 306, and then the same idea presumably in the law in 1935 in Nazi Germany. Right, restrictions on Jews eating together in the same synod, restrictions on Jews in dining cars and trains from 1939. You just go down the chart, and he has gathered together, what look like, 20 examples of these sorts of parallels between traditional, we'd say, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. He sort of collapses the distinction by providing this visual illustration of that. I don't want to deny that he's unaware that not all of these are particularly the Christian laws. They're not necessarily sort of continent-wide or passed by the church itself or the Vatican, right? Some of them come from councils, some of them are local, but for the most part, that doesn't impact his argument. Okay, that's sort of model number 1. I want to look at the second model offered by Yosef Yerushalmi in his response to Rosemary Ruther. And Yosef Yerushalmi is going to argue that there's a qualitative shift that occurs in the 20th century, that there is great discontinuity between what had happened prior to that and what happens in the 20th century. And he makes a very interesting observation about Rosemary Ruther's essay, in which he says, if you can see at the top, of the Christians' preservation of the Jews, we hear next to nothing in her article. That is, she simply talks about hindrance, opposition, hostility to Jews, but as he sees it, leaves out a key feature of Jewish life in Christendom, which is the Jews were protected, preserved. It's interesting how he looks at examples that sort of clash with his model. He writes in the second quote, right, if on occasion pre-modern Christian law protecting Jewish rights was violated, such cases represented departures from the norm. Right, and so again, this idea that Christianity was protective in some sense, and that breaks down in the 20th century. A bit more, that Jews are to be tolerated in the midst of Christendom, that they have the right to regulate their internal affairs according to law, that they're entitled to a basic protection of life, property, and the free exercise of their religion, so long as it does not directly interfere with the dominant faith. These principles remain constant in Christian law laid down through the Middle Ages. And the key distinction, he therefore says, is that at the bottom here, if the church did not decree the physical or spiritual extinction of Jewry, it must have been either because it could not bring itself to do it or because it was vital to the church not to do so. That is, that key step the church did not take, namely annihilation, elimination as policies. And he explains this in somewhat of a simple way. That is, there's a shift in the nature of society from a religious to a secular form of Jewish hatred, from a theological to a racial form of Jewish hatred, and that the nature of the 20th century is that it's a secular society, not a medieval society. Therefore, as I've said, he is offering the sort of contrast to the model of Hilberg. Now, I want to try to sort of pull some of this together with a last point here about the role of the study of history. And I want to look at the writings of a recent essay by David Nierenberg, formerly of Chicago, now at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Very prominent historian, wrote a book called Antijudaism about half a dozen years ago or so, who talked about the importance of the study of history and the way in which we have to know something about the past in order to deal with the dangers of the present. And he has this, I think, rather optimistic quote in this Wall Street Journal editorial about a month ago, he says, by calling our attention to past examples of how ideas like anti-Semitism have influenced humanity, history can provide an antidote to prejudice. And we need this antidote today because while anti-Semitic claims are often retailed as new revelations, they usually rest on very old beliefs. Okay, so as I said, I think it's a somewhat optimistic point of view about the role for history in dealing with these problems. I'm not sure I'd go as far as he does, but I would say that he's correct about understanding in particular the differences between different manifestations of hostility towards Jews. And therefore that task, at least today, falls to us as it does to others. I want to think just lastly a bit of a sort of meta framing of this question, which is the discussion about what's continuous and what's discontinuous, is it relevant to assessing the threat or the danger of opposition, hatred, hostility towards Jews? That is that the function that it serves? Continuity, I think, in general, is certainly easier to recognize. That is, looking for things that you see and say they are similar is kind of naturally easier. I think discontinuities in many ways harder to recognize and harder to know how to respond, because discontinuities in some sense looking for things that aren't there. But Nierenberg is right that any historical assessment has to grapple with this question. He's right to frame it that way, and I therefore appreciate the emphasis on trying as much as possible to sort of get this right. However, the last point I simply want to make, and this is my summary, but I think it's important to recognize that it's not simply a historical question or a question about how do we deal with danger, how do we deal with threat, which are all valuable questions in themselves. But I think what's at stake here isn't just history, but also how to assess the past. That is, how to assess statements from the past, acts or failures to act in the past morally. That is, if we see ourselves as in some way linked to these traditions, the Jewish and Christian traditions, and especially in the context of contemporary Jewish-Christian relations, we can't ignore this topic about the assessment of the impact of these actions and inactions, statements. When we're considering, in particular, religious teachings, we have to grapple in particular with things like context. And so when looking back to decide, how problematic is something at an ethical level, I mean, even all forms of hostility aren't the same, right? Hostility to establish boundaries, we might say, is different than hostility that is grounded on sort of fantastical notions of danger. And I therefore suggest that we approach these topics certainly from a historical lens, but I think also from within, in different ways. These are topics that are relevant to our traditions and the past that Jews and Christians experience, particularly as we look towards a better future between these two traditions. So I want to stop here and say thank you for the invitation to present.
Thank you, Adam, for you certainly succeeded in telling us about the blurring of the categories and how important it is for us today to assess the continuities and discontinuities. Before I hand the floor to Lev, I forgot to mention to all participants, and I apologize for that, that we welcome your questions in the Q&A section. I will look at the Q&A section. I haven't seen any questions appear yet, I guess because you were not told that you are allowed and supposed to ask questions to the panelists. Please do. I'm sure you have many questions and remarks to write down. And now, Lev, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Adam, for this very precise and interesting introduction to anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the past. And you really laid the ground, the base for my talk and my examples. And thank you for that. And it's very interesting, since we are dealing with continuity and discontinuity, we actually ask what has came up to the future from the past, what has continued, what has morphed, changed from the past. Is it the same? Is it new? Is some of it the same, most of it the same, or is it all new? And throughout the ages, throughout history, we see that things did change. Things did change, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. And we see that anti-Judaism in many cases, in many different parts of the globe, were very much political. And you laid the historical ground. I will try to continue with it, but I will also try to bring in some political thought into it. Now, when we look at the religious explanations, we see that in many cases, both in Judaism, in Christianity, and also in Islam, the very basic, raw, pure writings are not as hostile to other religions as politicians sometimes make them. And this is a very interesting point. Now, before I give some examples, I do want to say that if we look at the past, maybe 2,000 years or so, we see that, and I generalize by a lot, obviously, but we see that several explanations have evolved. Now, these are sometimes, these are all political, but sometimes they are based on religion, sometimes they are based on racial, politics, and even biology, science, pseudoscience, to be exact. Sometimes they are more cultural. Sometimes they're even based on thoughts of arguments of protectionism, to protect against something, in this case against the Jews. But if we look at racism in general, in xenophobia, we see that sometimes it's not just to protect group A from the Jews, but to protect group A from group B and D and then C and D and E and so on. So I would like to divide this anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism into several categories. Now, the first one, as you mentioned, is a religious category, and the category which basically argues that religion A is better than religion B. Now, B being Judaism and A being Christianity, but it is the same, by the way, or very much similar in regarding anti-Semitism with Islam. It is much the same and very similar. So the basic argument goes that the new religion is better because there is a new Messiah. God revealed himself to a new prophet, and so on and so on. Now, here is the point where politics comes into play, and the new religion or religions, if we are talking not just about Christianity but about Islam as well, new religions are seeking to compete for the audience, for the vote, and the audience in this case is the people, the believers, and they are seeking to grasp the believer and tackle down the competition, which in this case is the other religion, which is Judaism. This is the religious argument. Now, this is, historically speaking, this is one of the first arguments of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. Next, we see, as time goes by, and you have mentioned the Spanish medieval times and Inquisition and racial politics in Europe, and the colonial times in Europe and so on. So we see the development of racial politics, of pseudoscience, and so on, of claiming that race A is better than race B, and so on. And this entangles with the historical religious hatred of Jews. Now, the actual social and political change takes a few hundred years, but by the time of the Holocaust and even before, we see that within the 19th and 20th century, people like Arthur de Gobineau, maybe, that claim that Adam and Eve were the white race came from Adam and Eve, for example, and this brings us the biological argument, which basically says that the Jews are not just believers, but they are a certain race, and that is why they cannot be saved by change of religion. They cannot just change themselves and become Christians, for example. People like Arthur de Gobineau and obviously people like like Hitler claim that religious change is not enough. Change must be done by blood, and that is why Jews who changed their religion were yet still not accepted to society, to Christian and European society. This is argument number 2. Argument number 3 is the cultural argument, saying basically it continues the same spirit, if you will, and the argument goes that the Jewish culture is inferior to the European and to the Christian culture, and that is why Jews are inferior, and that is why they should be dealt with in various ways, and up to the stage of annihilation, as we all know. So the next argument is the argument of protectionism. So a society says basically, it argues that Jews are hostile and bad and evil and do wrongs to their society, to their own groups. Same goes for white supremacy in the US, for example, where they claim that Black people are they need to protect themselves from Black people. It is the same argument, exactly, argument of protectionism. They protect against Jews because Jews do apparently poison the wells, as we historically know, the conspiracy theory, or secretly want to dominate the globe, as we know from the conspiracy of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is argument number 4. Lastly, there is, of course, and this is very contemporary, of course, the last argument of basically philosophy, and this is usually adopted by the left and the radical left, where they combine anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and they claim basically that philosophically speaking, Jews are simply continuing the spirit of colonialism, and therefore they should not be supported at the very least, or should be opposed to. And how does it all connect to history? Well, if we go through time, and here I want to point you to several conclusions I made in 2 of my books. One conclusion, and I will share my screen just in a second. One conclusion continues what Adam has shown with canonical law, and in my book titled "Why Do People Discriminate Against Jews?" written with Jonathan Fox. We basically compare canonical law to the Nazi law, Nazi measure of legal measure against Jews, and we see a lot of continuity. And if I just share the screen, yeah, you can see the table. I just need a hands up if you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah. So here it is. So table 3.2 on page 72. So we compare canonical law to the Nazi measure. So now you can see specific examples. For example, an example from the Synod of Elvira, the prohibition of intermarriage and sexual intercourse between Christians and Jews, and this was 306 CE. And then you can see that on 15th September 1935, some years after Elvira, that the Nazis measured the law of protection of German blood in honor. Let's go to another example. Here it is. I highlighted. Jews barred from the streets during Passion Week. And we see this was in 538. And we can see that in 1938, the Nazis put a decree that authorizing local authorities to bar Jews from the streets on certain days. And this is largely the same. It is the same measurement, basically, and it continues from history. Now,
Lev, can you maybe make this a bit bigger? It's very small script.
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yes, of course. Is it better?
yes, this is much better. I
Yes,
apologize for the
Yes.
interference.
Yes, no problem at all. So on the left, we see the canonical law. Here it is. And on the right, we see the Nazi measurement. So let's go for another example. It is Christians may not attend Jewish ceremonies in 1267, Synod of Vienna. And in 1941, Nazis put the measurement that friendly relationship with Jews are prohibited, and most of Germans were Christians, so it is basically the same measurement. The ghettos, compulsory ghettos in Breslau in 1267, and then we see compulsory ghettos ordered by Heydrich in 1939. It is again the same measurement, and I won't go, the list goes on and on. I won't go through the whole list, but you can see the canonical law and the Nazi measurement, one near the other. It goes through on the last page, and let's see the last one. Jews may not obtain academic degrees, Council of Basel in 1434, and Nazis put on the law against overcrowding German schools and universities in 1933, and it was Jews were put out of universities in Russia before the Soviet Union and during the early years of the Soviet Union as well. It is not just in Germany. It did not happen just in Germany. So this is from the canonical law to the Nazi period. Now, let's go to this is my second book, published recently, and here I saw an interesting caricature on the dark web. Basically, it summarizes up the whole text of the protocols of the Elders of Zion into an illustration, and it says, they ask who is really in control, and they say that basically Jews control the Fed and Wall Street and internet spying and Hollywood and law courts and so on and so on and so on. Jews control every bad thing, every negative thing. And then if you again compare this to this accusation, right, of Jews controlling the Fed, internet spying, Hollywood, pornography, fake opposition, and so on, then what I did was to compare it to perceptions of Jews, very recent perceptions based on a survey index by the IDL. It is basically the same. So control of the Fed and Wall Street, the ADL found out that many think that Jews have too much power in business and too much power in the US government, and control global media regarding internet spying, and control global affairs, and so on and so on. And then you look at I compared it all to the historical anti-Jewish myth, which is based on the things, on the canonical law, on the things I just showed you and presented, and on much of the things Adam has showed you. So it all connects together. Ancient times and medieval times and contemporary times, and anti-Semitism is basically very much the same arguments, the same tropes, the same stereotypes, same accusations. For example, controlling of finance. Throughout the centuries, Jews have been associated with finances, money, and greed. Even you can connect internet spying to past times. So, for example, in the 20th century, conspiracies emerged that Jews control parts of life, including in media. Then it developed into controlling the internet, and so on. It is very interesting to see that there is almost a direct conceptual connection. Now, it is true that historically it might be more difficult to prove and connect the points, to prove the connection between all the points. I think that, and we will of course open it for discussion, but I think that it could be done and that it must be done, and Adam and myself are doing just a tiny bit of it as we speak right now. And I think that I will just stop the screen sharing. Yeah. And I think that in much of the Western world, which was influenced by Christianity, we can see pretty much basic similar arguments to those that occurred, that were present centuries ago, ages ago. And I hope you enjoyed this or learned something from this, not enjoyed, but learned something from this discussion. And of course, I will gladly answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lev. Yeah, you're right to point out that we couldn't enjoy this, but certainly learned a lot. And learning is always, I guess, some form of us enjoying something. It's my understanding that you point to a direct conceptual connection between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. I would like to suggest now that our panelists remark on each other's comments. So Adam, please go ahead if you would like to remark on Lev's insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Lev. I really appreciate you laying out in your categories these five, I don't know what, five types of hatred. What's remarkable is that when you put it in some detail, religious competition, biological differences, bad culture, protectionism, anti-colonialism, none of those sound like they have anything to do with each other, except for the fact that they all appear to be directed at the same party. And so it's really interesting to hear that, because they do, you know, on the face of them, there's such a diversity in even just the basic assumptions. Sort of what do people care about? I wonder if you could just say more about sort of how they cohere, besides the choice to focus on Jews. I mean, is there sort of some more there to it? Because superficial, at least, they seem so different.
Yes. So so how did I come up with this? So when I looked at the alt-right in Europe and in the US right now in our times, and when I look at the radical left as well, and when I analyze their politics and their main arguments of hostility towards Jews and towards Israel, this is what I come up with. These arguments are different. True, they are different, but they are all connected. They're all in the same basket. Conceptually, they are very similar, and a lot of politicians use them interchangeably as they wish against Jews. So this is what is very interesting, because as we know, during Nazi times they used it as well, same arguments against Jews, and even in the 19th and 20th century, for example, Karl Lueger, former mayor of Vienna, also said, famous quote, "I decide who is a Jew." So is he a rabbi? Can he really decide who is a Jew? No, he simply decides who is bad for politics and votes, and who is good for politics and votes. And the arguments also, right now at least, the arguments also vary between political spectrums, and every few years they bring up another one, and every argument supports the next, especially when you look at white supremacy, Christian white supremacy in the US, for example. You see that they base their arguments of anti-Semitism and in this regard, anti-Islam and anti-Black people, anti-Asian, and so on. They base it on these arguments as well. First, they say that, well, the other side's religion is bad. Then they say, well, they're not from the right race. And then they say, well, their culture is bad, and so on and so on. And lastly, the one who I think is very dangerous, because it is quite understandable, the argument of protectionism, because they say, well, look at the Jews controlling the money, look at the Muslims doing terror, and look at the Black people selling drugs. And these are just common tropes that are used by white supremacy in the US. They are all statistically wrong, very much wrong, obviously, but nevertheless, they still use them. And if you don't say, well, I'm a racist, I hate all of them, but you say, I'm not a racist, I'm just a protectionist and I'm trying to protect my group, you sound a lot better politically. And that is what they're doing right now in recent years. So I hope this answers your questions.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Lilian, you're muted.
Yes, I'm terrible tonight. I don't know. Apologies again. Thank you for telling me I was muted. Questions are coming in, but I would also like to give Lev the opportunity to ask Adam a question about his remarks. So please do so. If you want to do so.
Yes. So again, Adam, thank you for the presentation. And it is very interesting for me to maybe fill the gap between canonical times and contemporary times and kind of go in between and see, for instance, the trope of Jews controlling the either the media or finance and greediness and so on, to see what sort of thing you can find out or think about that happened during medieval times, and then maybe bring it up, and then we will have a straight conceptual line, a straight historical line that will connect all the dots. If you can think about something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so, two thoughts. I mean, certainly theologically, the patterns that get established in the very beginning of Christianity pretty much just don't change; they carry through. But of course, new things come out, and I guess most prominently would be things like linked with money, linked with Jews and money, and various roles for Jews, but also presented in theological terms. I mean, links with Judas and those sorts of images. And so, I guess you could say that certain ideas get born in one setting and then maybe flourish in another. I think it's harder to draw direct lines, but it's certainly the case that ideas that develop in strongly theological contexts take on a new life or a second life, or whatever metaphor seems to apply, in a different context. And so the way in which some of those ideas, sort of metastasize, that emerged in strongly religious contexts. The idea of, Jews, ritual murder accusations and blood libels, sort of, Jews being dangerous, and fantastical images of that, right? This Gavin Langmuir, the Stanford historian, called them like chimerical. Ideas that have no basis in reality, prove to have long lives to them, and so those emerge in very theologically suffused context, and then they sort of keep on going, even when the context changes. And so, it's hard to know what to do with that, right? So it's one thing to sort of draw lines. The challenge we all sort of face is, and I see that some of the questions coming in was like, how do you make those connections, as I suggested, and sort of what do you do with them? As I sit here and I think to myself, it's easy to draw connections. It's not easy to know what you do with them, and in some ways they're easily refuted, and often because the contexts are so different. And so in some ways it's superficially easy to draw connections, but it's hard to say sort of how deep they go. I in many ways feel like this is a topic that doesn't have a whole lot of clarity to it inherently, especially because we're jumping across centuries, and that's just sort of head spinning.
Thank you. I would like to read a few of the questions that have been coming in to you. You've already started answering some of them. At least you've answered partly, and probably answers are difficult to find. Let me start with a question from Murray Watson. There are obviously many clear and troubling parallels, but does the current state of historical scholarship allow us to draw cause-effect relationships between the early Christian measures and those taken by the Nazis, in the sense that leading Nazis were aware of these measures and consciously chose to replicate, adapt them? And a second question on the same topic from Giordano Bottecchia. I wonder about the relationship, the connection between canonical law and Nazi measures. How does the transition take place? Did the Nazis directly look for inspiration in canonical law to develop their measures, or is it a matter of ideas that were widespread in society and that reappear in the Nazi measures? Who would like to start?
I can say a little. I mean,
oh, okay, Adam, go ahead.
I would just say, I mean, though I'm not a Holocaust historian or German historian, but Murray's questions is a really good one, because I do enough to say, you know, there are a lot of different sort of parties who are potentially drawing from anti-Jewish theology, and so, you know, what did Hitler think? What did, you know, various leading Nazis think? I mean, I know a little bit what Hitler thought, but in some ways, putting that aside, what you do certainly have are German Christians, you know, and even more so people for the I forget the name of the committee, but, you know, sort of to take Jesus's Jewishness away, the re-Aryanization of Jesus. And in many ways, I mean, that's not a 20th century idea, right? I mean, one can only read the Gospel of John to see that process taking place in an unbelievably different context. But the sort of de-Judaizing of Jesus and the sort of presentation of Judaism as a kind of broken religion or a cast-off religion, I mean, those all have long legs, and that all shows up in, I mean, not just in the Committee for the Eradication of the Jewishness of Jesus, or whatever the name of the committee is called. Susanna Heschel wrote about this. But the Deutsche Christian, the German Christian, this suffuses all of their theology too, and that's pretty mainstream. You know, they're not the only Christians around, but they certainly have a lot to draw, and they certainly draw on a lot of those tropes. And so, to the extent that the theology is reused, it's certainly used by it's reused by the theologians. I don't know so much about on the political side.
Thank you, Adam. Liz?
Yes. First of all, I agree with Adam, so I have nothing to add for the historical review. I do want to note that we sometimes like to think as people that look at things from above, from 10,000 miles and from above, and look at the various parts within each case and throughout history. Sometimes we jump and read about dinosaurs, then we read about medieval times, then we go back to ancient Egypt, and then we go to another time era. And this is very comfortable, of course, but we have to remember that as people, we are social creatures, political creatures, and we live and continue our traditions and our cultures, and we simply sometimes, as superficial as it sounds, continue the way that our fathers and forefathers have lived. And this goes to Europe and to Christians in Nazi Germany and even before. It applies to them all. They simply lived and acted and accepted what their ancestors have taught them, and their ancestors learned it from their own ancestors, and the steps go back and back and back. So it just continues the same cultural and social political scene of being hostile to Jews, and it continues today. So I argue, and so I think.
Thank you. We have two questions, and I will couple them that relate to the racial aspects of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. One from Sonia Kirchheimer. Many thanks to both speakers for their thorough analysis. Both have referred to the racial aspect in anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Should our work in interreligious dialogue not emphasize the eradication of this concept and concentrate on religion and culture aspects? And also from Ron Hönig, one can't help but remark that many of the kinds of prohibitions form the basis of racism against non-Jewish racial groups such as African Americans, Uyghurs, etc. So does anti-Semitism, is it a model for many racisms? Is anti-Semitism a model for many racisms, I guess, is the quintessential question asked by both our speakers. Please, who would like to go first? Lev.
Yeah, I can try and answer this. Well, anti-Semitism is sometimes referred to as the longest hatred, and I think in our times it combines a lot of the things that are within racism. Now, if you analyze the concept of racism historically, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, people didn't hate other groups because they were racially different. They just hated them because of politics. They wanted to enslave them, and for in this example, white people could enslave other white people, not just black people. And with the era of colonialism in the 15th and 16th century in Europe, politicians, before that kings and rulers and then politicians, had to invent, so to speak, racism to give the people, the concepts and the reasons to control other people. They needed to say that, hey, look, we are better than the ones in Africa or Latin America or in Asia, and therefore we must control them, enslave them, and on the way show them the right way, so to speak, the way of enlightenment, and give them, for instance, Christianity or culture or other progressive means and aspects. And if you conceptually think about it, so Christianity tried to do the same with Judaism. It said, okay, we are the new religion. We sow the light. We want to enlighten you. And if you will not become Christians like us, we will have laws against you. And eventually it's all mixed up together, racism and anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Adam.
Yeah. I mean, a question like this makes me think that I'm probably more inclined towards continuity than discontinuity. One of, as we've been talking, when I had this image of someone like Voltaire, who was remarkably harsh on Catholic thought and Christian teaching and theology, along with others in that period, but was, in many ways, very consistent in his hostility towards Jews, though expressed in different terms. And so the question about sort of how important is the racial lens for understanding this problem, I guess I often think, I'm not sure that the sort of milieu matters a whole lot, that in some ways it seems to me it's a kind of borrowing from whatever the form of discourse is at the time, but that there's continuity in the process, in sort of inclination of hostility and othering, which is in a sense sort of, it's, it still has to be eternal, but I don't know the fact that that sort of that hostility to Jews manifests in racial terms when people are speaking racially or pseudoscientifically, says that there's a whole lot there about racist hatred to be focused on, but rather a kind of new manifestation of an old problem using different terms. And so I'm not particularly sort of inclined to I guess I'd say sort of emphasize the racial quality of this any more than sort of the other qualities that it manifests. Much of it seems rather timeless and sort of malleable across very different settings. And so I'm not sure one ought to dominate, though certainly religion has been prominent by virtue of its longevity. I mean, theological anti-Judaism in a sort of classical sense has been around a long time, and so that sort of deserves a lot of attention. But the forms it takes, I'm not sure matter a whole lot, judging by the way in which it sort of jumps over those boundaries and just sort of takes whatever form is, around whatever language is being used at that time. It's kind of a depressing answer.
So much of it is depressing, I'm afraid. I'm going to again put together two questions, one from Marie Boyce, the other from Phil Cunningham, because they both start in the same way. I will start with Mary and then share Phil's question, because Phil ends with another question. So let me read this out to you. Mary Boyce says, regarding canon laws and later Nazi laws, granted the shamefulness of early church legislation, these laws were regional and local, and it's not clear to what extent they were enforced or enforceable. The critical difference seems to lie with the immense power of the state, so that the Nazis had the power to enforce their laws with such tragic consequences for Jews. Is not the better analogy between the Jim Crow laws of the American South and Nazi legislation, as there is solid scholarship supporting their relationship as cause-effect? And Phil says, a question for Lev. When comparing secular and ecclesiastical laws, isn't it important to reckon with the fact that the latter were never universally enacted across the Catholic population, but were sporadic and regional? To both of you, and I think that's a good final sort of question. Many churches condemn anti-Semitism regularly, but seemingly to little effect. What, in your opinions, should they do? Who would like to go first? Adam. Lev. Okay.
Yeah,
the minute I say one name, the other starts speaking. That's actually a very good method to get you both to reply. Lev, go ahead, please.
Yes, regarding the fact that many canonical laws, many early Christian laws hostile to Jews were regional and partial, and sometimes they were not enacted at all. they were just written, but the population didn't do anything about it. Yes, it is true, and we see that that throughout the empires, many states had their own concepts regarding Jews, taking into account local relations with Jews, historical local relations with Jews, and so on. And yes, it is true that some were better to Jews than the others. And if you compare it to Nazi Germany and to the whole empire of Europe at the time, so you see that you had many anti-Semites or anti-Jewish people throughout Europe and beyond the pale of settlements to the east, in Russia as well. But not all of them enacted the same laws and the same feelings against Jews. And the Nazi state did. So it brings a very interesting, you bring a very interesting topic, because we sometimes look at the Nazi state as a global case of something horrible and insane, but they were a European state, Christian European state, part of Europe. And the fact that most European people did not go on the same path shows that exactly that most of the European Christians did not hold such radical feelings. Maybe they did think some things were true about Jews, some were not, and so on, but their environment did not foster such horrible anti-Semitism as within the Nazi state. And the question of what should be done regarding Christian anti-Semitism, well, this is this is the question, right? It is a very difficult question. And I think that in our times, there is an open discussion to discuss such topics like anti-Semitism and like racism. And there's a movement that looks into the past. If 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it was too politically incorrect to look at the past, look at like do a soul searching process and say, okay, we were wrong here and here and there. Now we see that many religious leaders are doing it, and I hope this will continue. And maybe we'll have we are already having better relationship between Jews and Christians and other religions as well, in the East and with Islam and so on. So I hope that each part will do their own soul searching and look at the past and say, okay, it's at this point or that point we were wrong and we need to correct this, so we could all live together in peace. This is what I think. Thank you.
Adam.
Yeah, so Mary's question is a really good question, especially at this point in our discussion, because really, I mean, it raises the issue of continuity, discontinuity in a very complicated way. And so on the one hand, the appearance of eliminationist hostility to Jews emerged at the time when that was a possibility. Now, you know, could there have been attempts at this in some more limited fashion earlier with massacres? And I mean, yes, but you're right. The presence of a state power to implement such policies is in some ways a unique feature of the modern age of the 20th century. what makes the challenge then of a comparison so difficult is because when we talk about, the 4th century or the 7th century, we're talking about times where that wasn't even a possibility. Practically speaking, I assume, right? That is, the modern period brings with it certain types of destructive power. And therefore, the canon laws that, interestingly, often get repeated because they don't stick, because people are clearly doing otherwise. But, do they reflect, just an awareness of how far that they can go practically, but that they couldn't go further, that they didn't want to go further? Would it have mattered if there were laws from the church that said, we want to eliminate Jews? I'm not, again, it's a distinctly 20th century possibility as a practical sense that I suppose the church doesn't have, certainly not in much of the time that, we were looking at texts from the 4th century, 6th century. And so it's hard to compare the two, right? It's hard to compare the two because the decisions about what to do or how to limit Jews or be hostile to Jews in those church laws are clearly shaped by what it is they can do. And it therefore makes sort of drawing comparisons across time very difficult. Now, you rightly draw attention to the really most serious problem, which is that the sort of the cat's out of the bag, which is that we're now on the wrong side of the possibility of use, of course, of murderous state power, and that kind of changes everything. It therefore is, again, hard to sort of know, if anything, sort of where that goes. I mean, we've seen it go very badly. Is that an anomaly? Well, again, we don't really have it in the past either, but it kind of couldn't happen in the past in the same way. So really, I mean, again, I'm sort of leaving head spinning, feeling head spun. My head is spinning often on these questions because of the difficulty of making these parallels or connections in circumstances that are so dramatically different. They inevitably have to influence things like, the possible shapes, the ideal. What do we want to do with Jews? Well, what can we do with Jews? And what's possible in our time and day? It's really hard. And so I might sort of dignify the complexity of the question without trying to answer it. Sorry. The last question that Phil raised, well, what would be better? I mean, Phil and I think most of this call be quick to recognize the enormous improvement that's occurred. I do think there's a risk of backsliding. The need for churches to make education a priority, and in particular, I would emphasize, not surprisingly, sort of the training of seminarians, training of priests, etc. And an issue that I've really thought a lot about lately and has gotten some attention is sort of understanding of Jesus's Jewishness. The temptation to fall into a term I'm going to steal from Phil, but an oppositional imagination, that is to see Jesus as necessarily opposed to Judaism, and therefore you have to kind of construct a form of Judaism that operates as kind of negative foil, is very easy and happens all the time. I think even among those who don't seek to do that, I think there's a real need for that awareness of that pattern to just to be clear to people. I mean, lately it's been in popular Christian publications. I mean, it's a real temptation. The other thing I would just mention is certainly in churches that are in the West, in the sort of first world. I don't think these topics get much attention at all, and therefore I think the presentation of Jews and what people read is not grounded in any sort of reality. Now, I'm not sure about the practical implications of that immediately, but it's certainly the case that the world is getting, so to speak, smaller, and therefore people from different parts of the world are now mixing in different ways. We see this in the Catholic Church in America with priests coming from all over, Africa, for example. And so I think it makes it a more pressing issue than simply saying like, well, it's good for them not to think bad stuff. Well, actually, it's good for people to know how to talk about Jews and Judaism, because some of them may actually be around Jews and Judaism if these trends continue. So thanks.
Thank you. We had a few more remarks and questions coming in, but our time is up. And also I feel that your concluding remarks, Adam, both of you, but you point to what possibly could be a way forward, not eradicating a problem that has been with us for 2000 years, but becoming even more aware of it, especially spreading that awareness to people that don't seem to have it, and trying to get the institutions to act on proper education and awareness, and maybe also find inspiring models in what our friend Markus Himmelbauer mentions in one of his remarks. At times, the church had inspiring models of attitudes toward the Jews, and maybe highlighting this today could help us as well. I would like to thank our panelists for taking up the challenge of discussing a very difficult and, as you said, Adam, head-spinning question, and you did so bringing us great insights. So thank you very much. Thank you to all participants who stayed with us throughout this session and showed great interest with their very interesting and to-the-point questions and remarks. And don't forget to register to the ICCJ newsletter if you have not already done so. And thank you for your continuous support of our organization. I see a lot of thumbs up and claps in this, so thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.